right, welcome back to another episode of the Psychopedia podcast. I'm your host, Investigator Slater, here with a brand new episode. But before we move forward with new content, I want to flash back for a second because most of you know that we covered Diddy. Obviously, it was a 3-parter. It could probably be a 10-parter at this point. And I wanted to let everybody know that I'm pretty positive about this, that I'm going to be going to Diddy's trial, either this week or next week. I spoke with somebody who went, and she kind of gave me the inside scoop on what goes on there. They have like spaces available if there's overflow outside of the courtroom. So I'm pretty positive that no matter what, I'm getting in. I also know a person or two, so I'm pretty confident that I would get in. And I just feel like there's nothing better than boots on the ground when you're trying to collect information and make your assessment of what's going on. That's like something I'm very big on, which I think you guys probably realize by now. Like when we did the Gilgo Beach case, I went to Gilgo Beach. Anything that I can do to put myself in the center of something in terms of investigative work, research, just getting my finger on the pulse of what's happening, I really want to be on that front line. If this is your first time here, welcome. If it is your 100th and whatever time here, welcome home, freak. So happy and grateful to have each and every one of you. It is never lost on me when I'm thinking about who's on the other side of this microphone and that you're choosing to spend the next hour or so with me. Thank you. Thank you for your support and for your comments. And for those of you who subscribe and like and do all that kind of stuff, all that media stuff that I'm not great with, but I'm getting better with. Thank you. I see all of you. I love all of you. I appreciate all of you. If you love me, I guess, and you love what we do here on Psychopedia, but you want more, which is relatable because I want to give you more, there's a place for that. It's patreon.com/psychopediapod, where you get loads of extra content. And also now it's like Patreon version 2. I decided to open up the weekly unhinged episodes to you guys, to have you guys sign up to be my guest co-host over on Patreon. So basically, we'll let you know in advance what case we're going to be talking about. You know, we ask that you re-listen to the case, whatever, take notes, just get a handle on it, and then join me on a Zoom so you can live anywhere in the world and we will rehash the case and we will talk about it, or we won't, or we'll talk about whatever comes up. I can't wait to get you guys involved, and I just love getting to know all of you. So if that sounds like something you want to participate in, join Patreon. If that sounds like something you want to listen to, join Patreon. If it's not your thing, that's okay too. There's loads of other stuff. There's a monthly Slaterpedia, which is a full fat true crime episode that is not released anywhere else except Patreon. Merch discounts, live streams, private chats, like a lot, guys, a lot. So go check it out. But also if you don't check it out, that's okay too. I love you where you are, who you are, and however I can get you. Oh, and one more thing about Patreon, and this is probably the most important thing that I should lead with. All episodes that we release on Psychopedia are released on Patreon same day, ad-free. So you're getting the same content, the same time it's released publicly, but without ads. So if that sounds good, go check it out. And while we're on the topic of Patreon, I just want to give you a few names, a few shout outs, give them their propers over there. And also just to like show you how fucking creative these people are. We have Implosions Are Us, which is a shout out to the Titan Submersible Slaterpedia episode that I released last month over on Patreon. There's The Nina, which I guess is the female version of El Nino. There's Psychopedia Serial Killer, aka Bob. Amazing. Zero Sophistication, which I love because we just rugged, and we're rugged over there. And then the last 3 I want to give a special shout out to are the ones who joined me on an unhinged episode over on Patreon. And we had the best freaking time ever. So shout out to Shit Show with a Bow, Chaos Resolver, which I could really use a Chaos Resolver in my life, and Wheel and a Spoke. Without any more further ado, I really want to take you into this week's case because I think a lot of you will remember this case. I remember this case. I remember when it happened in real time. I was absolutely petrified. So those of you who lived through this experience as well, and you remember the headlines and you remember the news stories and the interviews and the witness statements, you're probably still haunted by it to this day. I know I am. I'll speak for myself. I am. And if you don't know this case, I'm just going to say buckle up. And to that, I'm also going to say pun intended. Okay, here we go. On the night of July 28th, 2008, A man boarded Greyhound bus 1170 in Edmonton, Canada, just after midnight. His destination was a 13-hour ride across the cracked, endless spine of the Canadian prairies to Winnipeg, the capital of the Canadian province of Manitoba. This was a trip long enough for most people to catch some sleep, maybe reflect on life, but for this man, it was a descent, deeper into the fractured corridors of a mind already unraveling. And no one noticed. No one noticed this guy. Why would they? He looked like any other weary traveler fading into the late-night shuffle of strangers and ticket stubs. The engine of the bus hummed, the tires groaned against the asphalt, and this man stared blankly ahead, just a regular-looking passenger, but eyes vacant, posture still. This man wasn't there, you know what I mean? Not fully. He was trapped in some private world where logic was a ghost and danger wore the face of God. By the evening of July 29th, this man stepped off the bus in Erickson, Manitoba. He carried with him 3 pieces of luggage and found a bench near a small grocery store where he parked himself for the night, though he did not sleep a wink. According to a witness, he was spotted at 3 a.m. sitting bolt upright, wide-eyed, staring into the dark like it owed him answers. The next morning, still glued to that same random bench, this man decided to sell his brand new laptop to a 15-year-old local boy named Darren for $60. No bargaining, no reason, no real interaction. The boy walked off thrilled with the deal, and the man barely seemed to even register the transaction. It felt like he was responding to commands broadcast on some frequency that only his mind could tune into. By early evening, just before 6 p.m., the man reboarded the same bus, Greyhound 1170, headed for Winnipeg. There were 36 people on board that bus, and not a single one of them had the faintest clue that the man with the hollow stare and sunken silence was not just another passenger. He was a ticking bomb in human form, and the countdown had officially begun. The man settled into his seat as his eyes scanned the passengers with a blank, clinical gaze. He then got up and moved seats for no apparent reason, now sitting 1 row in front of the bathroom beside a young man half asleep with his headphones on, head against the window. Then, somewhere deep inside the man, the fragments of his mind started to fully break apart. Hallucinations bled into thought. Delusion roared louder than reality. And beneath his skin, it was as if something had come unglued, something feral, terrified, and uncontainable, clawing its way to the surface. And when it did, it broke through, something primal and unstoppable. And the man calmly reached into his bag at this point, drew out a massive knife, and without hesitation began savagely plunging it into the 22-year-old's neck seated beside him. The first scream didn't even register before the second thrust landed. Blood sprayed across the windows. Chaos detonated inside the bus. Passengers leapt over seats, clawing to escape, their shoes slipping in the gore pooling beneath their feet. And then, as if the carnage wasn't enough, the man sawed through muscle and bone with chilling precision, decapitating his victim and lifting the severed head to the window like a grotesque trophy, staring blankly out at the horrified crowd that had just fled the rolling slaughterhouse. Then, in one final act of unimaginable depravity, the man opened the chest and abdominal cavities of his victim, removed his organs, and consumed parts of the remains. His madness laid bare in the most visceral, haunting way possible. This is the brutal, tragic case of the Greyhound bus beheading. By the way, Greyhound is the name of the bus company for anyone that's outside of the U.S. who may not know. I have taken Greyhound many times. My producer I know has, back and forth many, many times. And he was alive during this time period as well. And he just popped in to be like, yeah, I was terrified taking the Greyhound after this. I'm telling you, I'm still traumatized on public transportation after this case, knowing about this case. And with good reason. It was absolutely horrific. Okay, so let me begin by telling you about the perpetrator. Vince Weiguang Li, the perpetrator, was born in Dangdong, China on April 30th, 1968, the second of three children. And his story really began in the humdrum of everyday life, where his father worked as a custodian and his mother taught math. That said, Vince was born a month premature, so was I, by the way, and his early years were said to have been marked by fragility. Also relatable. My twin sister was under 5 pounds, so yeah. Psychiatrists who later reviewed Vince's early life described him as a quote-unquote sickly child, frail, withdrawn, and developmentally delayed. He didn't speak or walk until the age of 5, and he didn't start elementary school until he was 9, already years behind his peers in both body and mind. Eventually, though, Vince's health and academic progress caught up when he entered high school, and he graduated alongside his peers before enrolling in automotive engineering at the Wuhan Institute of Technology. By 1992, Vince graduated with a bachelor's degree in computing, and from 1994 to 1998, he worked as a computer software engineer in Beijing. Then, Vince met Anna, his future wife, while working at a factory, and soon the two were married. To those closest to him, his wife and most of his family, Vince seemed like any other man. He really didn't display any signs of instability or mental illness for much of his adult life. That said, his father claims to have observed something very different in his son. He described Vince as a, quote, stubborn and restless man who couldn't sit still, was always shifting, always moving, never quite at peace with his surroundings. Despite the outward normalcy, and I use that word loosely, normalcy, something in Vince's energy and disposition just felt a little bit off, as if he was driven by forces beyond his own understanding or control. On June 11, 2001, Vince and Anna immigrated to Canada through the Federal Skilled Worker Program, hopping from one low-paying job to another as they settled into their new life. Then in 2004, Anna reported that Vince had started to hear voices, a troubling shift that seemed to signal the beginning of his gradual and eventually catastrophic unraveling. As Vince drifted from city to city chasing job leads and survival wages, his behavior grew increasingly unstable. His grip on reality loosened with each passing month, the lines between delusion and truth blurring into a dangerous haze. The slow mental decline continued unchecked until November 7, 2006, when Vince officially became a Canadian citizen. On paper, a huge milestone, but in reality, a man slipping through the cracks of a system that was unprepared to catch him. According to court-appointed psychiatrist Dr. Stanley Yaron, Vince's mental decline seemed to really take root during his time as a maintenance worker at the Grant Memorial Church in Winnipeg. For 6 months, Vince held that job without incident, until, as he later claimed, he began to hear the voice of God. And what followed wasn't a spiritual awakening, but the unraveling of a fragile mind teetering on the edge of full-on delusion. Vince really believed that God told him he was, quote, the third story of the Bible and the second coming of Jesus, a man destined to save humanity from an impending alien invasion. And this voice, or this auditory hallucination, which is what it really was, wasn't just a whisper either. It was more of a command. And it instructed Vince to walk across the country, sometimes for days on end, catching buses, sleeping on the roadside, and vanishing without warning. Anna would watch helplessly as Vince would disappear for days at a time, only to return to her with wild eyes and tales about divine visions. She knew something was wrong, but Vince refused help, paranoid that medical professionals and hospitals were part of a conspiracy involving alien infiltrators that were just out to get him. Vince began carrying around a buck knife for protection against these aliens, a knife that would later decapitate an innocent young man on a Greyhound bus. So I always come back to this conversation or this thought or these questions about, religious belief and mental health issues. And I say that, if that came out disrespectful, it is not at all what I meant. Because I'm not religious, so I struggle to understand how it is that people can speak to this unknown entity. And where is the line between somebody speaking to an entity that they refer to as God versus somebody with a mental health issue speaking to their version of whatever it is they think is there, right? And somebody said something to me once, and it really clicked. And I think I have a better grasp now. And again, I say all of this really with just a respectful curiosity, but this is what somebody once said. Praying to God is religion. Speaking to God is faith. If God is speaking back to you, that's where mental health issues come into play, or the concern of mental health issues enters the picture. I thought that was just an interesting way to put it. Anyway, Anna, Vince's wife, recalls Vince crying at home and obsessing over his visions of God and his supposed mission to protect humanity against aliens. Unfortunately, by March 2005, Vince's mental state had deteriorated so dramatically that Anna felt that she could no longer tolerate being married to him, prompting her to initiate a separation. And I can't imagine the position that Anna was in because, as a spouse, right, through thick or thin, better for worse, sickness and in health, you want to be there for your partner. I know I certainly want to be there for firefighter Dave through it all, but I imagine in situations like this, you become so overwhelmed and so scared that you become sort of this individual in a flight or fight position. So I don't necessarily blame Anna for feeling that she needed to leave, but it is upsetting to think that presumably when he needed somebody the most is when people began to leave. I'm not judging her because, again, I can't imagine the position she was in. But after Anna left, Vince wound up leaving for Thompson in hopes of making a fresh start. He took various jobs, one as a part-time barista at a Tim Hortons, which, by the way, love Tim Hortons cafes. They have them in New York City. Delish. Ew, forget I just said delish. That word is just horrible. Like, please erase that from your memory. Another as a gas station attendant, and then another working as an overnight maintenance worker at a local Walmart. However, Vince was unable to stay employed for longer than just a few days due to his intense irritability and psychological deterioration, because it turned out that, unsurprisingly, a new city did nothing to curtail or stop his delusions. In September 2005, the voice in his head told Vince to abandon everything once again and to head to Toronto, claiming it would be easier to find work there. But when that plan failed, the voice then told him to walk back to Winnipeg and to discard his luggage along the way. He was ultimately discovered by Ontario Provincial Police wandering aimlessly on Highway 427, emaciated, dehydrated, and muttering, quote, "I'm following the sun as God had commanded." Despite undergoing an examination at the William Osler Health Center, Vince Lee was never formally diagnosed with schizophrenia at the time. While some reports suggest that staff suspected a serious mental illness, including schizophrenia, no official diagnosis was recorded, likely due to the brevity of his stay, because he was like in and out, his decision to discharge himself against medical advice, and the absence of a comprehensive psychiatric evaluation, which would have required extended observation. But one thing was clear, Vince's condition was worsening. It makes you wonder, right? Like if the cops brought Vince in, right? They found him wandering aimlessly. He was dehydrated. He was clearly unwell. They brought him in to be admitted into a psychiatric facility, right? Where I believe he was likely there for 72 hours because Canada is the same as the US in terms of the mandatory holding period. Why wasn't a comprehensive evaluation done where he would have received a proper diagnosis and presumably treatment? And we do circle back to this, but I'm just kind of planting that seed or that question now. Upon discharge, Vince headed back to China. Though he managed to find work easily, he couldn't hold it down for more than a few days, and this was the pattern wherever he was. His irritability was too much, and his parents soon noticed his erratic behavior as well. Anna actually joined Vince for a brief time in China, even though they were separated, in an effort to try to make things work again. But the man she once knew had so entirely been replaced by someone she no longer recognized at all. At this point, they officially divorced, and Vince returned back to Canada, settling in Toronto, where the pattern of instability continued as his symptoms escalated. Pop quiz, you little psychos. Approximately what percentage of individuals with schizophrenia experience auditory hallucinations? A, 25%, B, 55%, C, 70%. The answer is C, which is astounding. Auditory hallucinations, especially hearing voices, are amongst the most common symptoms in schizophrenia, affecting more than 70% of patients. Because of the way the illness disrupts the brain's language and perception systems, So, in people with schizophrenia, areas of the brain responsible for processing sound and producing speech, like the auditory cortex and the Broca's area, can become hyperactive or miswired, leading the brain to misinterpret internal thoughts as external voices. This is compounded by dopamine dysregulation and the mesolimbic pathway, which can make ordinary or imagined thoughts feel intense, urgent, or even threatening. Many people with schizophrenia also struggle with reality monitoring, meaning they can't easily distinguish between what's real and what's imagined, or between their own thoughts and the perceived voices of others. Often these voices mirror past trauma or emotional experiences, especially if the individual had a history of neglect or abuse, and their brain may replay those dynamics under stress. Ultimately, what we understand as quote-unquote hearing voices is the brain's fragmented and disordered attempt to make sense of internal chaos, often turning it into something that feels very real and very terrifying. So Vince lived in his car for a while until Anna, despite everything, started sending him money. She even helped him to move back in with her in Winnipeg because, according to Anna at this point, Vince actually seemed a little bit happier than he had been in years, and she was optimistic about the future. Again, they're divorced at this point, but I guess, you love someone, and you maybe keep that door open, and she was seeing glimmers of hope for the future and a little bit of the Vince she likely fell in love with. Unfortunately, though, the other shoe dropped in the form of auditory hallucinations and intensifying paranoia. Because keep in mind, at this point, he's not being treated. So by June 2008, Vince's mental state spiraled faster than anyone could keep up with. On a sudden impulse, he once again flew back to China to visit his family for one day. And when he returned to China for one day, he told his father that he was simply there to find a wife. Obviously, we're not making sense here. When Vince got back to Canada after being in China for one day, he was fired from his job at Walmart after a confrontation with a coworker and then took up work at a McDonald's as a cashier, as well as a newspaper delivery guy. But at this point, Vince was well and truly going off the rails. In the days leading up to the killing, Vince asked for time off from his delivery job, claiming that he needed to go to Winnipeg for a different job interview, though no one knew exactly what kind of job he was supposedly interviewing for. Then, on July 24th, 2008, he left the home he shared with Anna, penning a goodbye note to her before he left that simply said, quote, "Don't look for me. I wish you were happy," end quote. Now, given his history of disappearing without a word, Anna really didn't think much of this at first. But then 2 days later, when Vince called and confirmed that he was not coming back, she realized, too late, that something had shifted in him for good, like it locked into place, something that wouldn't and couldn't be undone. And this brings us now to the top of the episode in terms of timeline. July 28th, 2008. At 12:05 p.m., Vince boarded a Greyhound bus bound for Winnipeg, where he sat motionless, clutching his luggage like it was the last tangible link to a life that he was rapidly losing grip on. By the evening of the 29th, he stepped off the bus in Erickson, Manitoba, and made his way to a bench next to a dusty grocery store. Remember, he stayed the night on that public bench. His body kind of slumped as the hours stretched on, but he remained wide awake, just staring. By morning, he sold his brand new laptop to a 15-year-old boy for the measly $60 that I mentioned, after first propping up a sign that he had handwritten on. It was like a cardboard sign that he propped against the bench saying, "Laptop for sale, $600 or best offer." Kid came up to him with $60 and a transaction was made. Now, the Royal Canadian Mounted Police ultimately located and seized that laptop from the boy, and inside they found more than 20 resumes, each one an attempt by Vince to reimagine himself or to reimagine a life and to try to piece together something through the screen. Applications for jobs at convenience stores, fast food joints, IT departments, and, interestingly, even the Royal Canadian Mounted Police. But there was something darker hidden within as well, because alongside ordinary photos were also images of female models, as well as military parades from the People's Liberation Army. Additionally, there were pictures that Vince had taken himself, gorgeous mountain landscapes in British Columbia, as well as several angles of a BAE CT 155 Hawk mid-flight. People thought that this was concerning after it came out, like maybe he was plotting something on a big scale. Also, just FYI, I thought this was a nice little piece of information to share. I don't know. I thought it was nice, so I'm sharing it. The police actually bought that kid who bought the laptop from Vince. They actually bought him a new laptop because he didn't do anything wrong by buying the laptop from Vince. He had a fair and square transaction. So after the cops confiscated it, I said that weird, whatever, roll with it. They bought him a new one. I thought that was nice. Anyway, the most chilling discovery, however, in terms of Vince's technology here, was a single unsent message, a letter that he had written to family or friends. We're not sure exactly who because it wasn't addressed to anyone in particular, but it was going back in China. It was somebody that he intended to read it back in China. It was undated, but its tone was haunting. In this note, Vince spoke about how he'd enjoyed living in Canada, but admitted that it wasn't what he expected. His words just dripped with longing for home, the kind of longing that made him feel like an outsider in a place where he could never fully belong. It was a confession of isolation, as though he were already preparing himself to return to a past that he couldn't outrun. And this wasn't just homesickness. This was nothing against Canada. It was just further evidence of a man teetering between reality and delusion, headed down a path that he couldn't stop, and just reflecting on a larger sense of isolation that he felt in his own skin. So this is how he was feeling when he got on that Greyhound bus. And as fate would unfortunately have it, on the evening of July 30th, 2008, a 22-year-old carnival worker named Tim McLean boarded that same Greyhound bus 1170, leaving Edmonton after working at a fair and heading home to Winnipeg. Tim nestled in near the back of the bus, just one row ahead of the restroom, and soon drifted off to sleep with his headphones blocking out the world around him as he embarked upon what should have been for him a 22-hour ride home. The bus, rolling along the Yellowhead Highway, made its routine stop in Erickson, Manitoba, which is where a man struggling with untreated schizophrenia named Vince Lee officially boarded. Vince initially took a seat near the front of the bus, but after a rest stop in Brandon, decided to move toward the back to take a seat beside Tim instead. The two men barely exchanged a glance. Tim was like lost in his music and sleep, and he barely even registered this man with a shaved head wearing sunglasses now sitting beside him, which is completely relatable. I mean, whether I'm on a plane, I'm on a bus, I'm on a subway, honestly, I never really consider who's sitting next to me except for being like polite, right? Like, hi, how are you? Do you have enough room? Like that kind of a thing. But otherwise, it's headphones in and I'm in my own world. Sadly for Tim, without warning, while he was in his own world, Vince suddenly produced a large knife, the blade flashing briefly before it plunged deeply and intentionally into his neck. The attack was swift and it was brutal. Tim, helpless, didn't even have time to scream before the blood began pouring from his throat, soaking into his clothing and into the fabric of his seat. The bus driver at this point panicked, swerved and pulled over to the side of the road, and within moments, every passenger fled that bus, desperate to escape the nightmare unfolding within. Now, two men, one who was just a passing truck driver named Christopher Algieri, who had been hauling a shipment of metal pipes, along with another man who was a veteran combat engineer who'd been a passenger on the bus, attempted to board the bus along with the driver to stop Vince. But as soon as they neared, Vince lunged at them with the bloody knife and forced them to retreat. This truck driver who stopped, by the way, is like so badass, so heroic. I mean, all three of these men were. But this truck driver was driving by and just saw commotion. Not only did he stop his truck to make sure that like the people were okay, but once he heard what was going on, took it upon himself. He had nothing to do with the situation to try to help. So I just want to give props to that guy and, of course, to everybody else. And I don't judge anybody, by the way, who did not make a move to reboard the bus. I can't imagine the fear they were feeling. So at this point, the men who tried to help left the bus, and then they closed the door and locked Vince inside to prevent him from being able to leave and potentially harm other people. Now alone with Tim's bloody, lifeless body, Vince showed no signs of stopping. With chilling precision, he dragged Tim onto the floor of the aisle where he proceeded to saw and hack at his neck before standing up to show everyone outside the knife in one hand and Tim's decapitated head in the other. And yet, even after that horrific display of brutality, the nightmare still did not end, because Vince turned back to the body almost methodically and began dismembering it, tearing into flesh and consuming parts of Tim's remains while the world outside stood frozen in shock. He tore open Tim's torso and chest and removed his heart, liver, lungs, and intestines, stringing them around the bus, turning the space into a twisted, macabre shrine to his madness. And this went on for hours. Vince paced the length of the bus like a wild predator, gnawing on his prey's remains as onlookers scrambled to contain the situation. At 8:30 p.m., the RCMP in Portage-la Prairie received the first reports of a stabbing on the Greyhound bus, and by 9 p.m., they arrived at the scene only to find the situation completely spiraling further out of control because Vince had attempted to drive the bus away, but the driver, anticipating such a move, actually engaged the emergency immobilizer, leaving the bus inoperable and trapping Vince inside. Once again, badass heroic move, like such foresight, you know what I mean, or forethought. So the RCMP officers arrived to find the passengers on the roadside, their faces pale with shock, some crying, others vomiting. And inside, Vince pacing like an animal caught inside of a cage, muttering to himself, occasionally stopping to mutilate Tim's body further. This sort of standoff dragged on as negotiators and heavily armed tactical units were called in. But Vince, unfazed, continued to butcher the corpse and taunt law enforcement by licking Tim's blood off of his fingers. Officers could hear him speaking, repeating eerie phrases like, "I have to stay on this bus forever." His detachment, Vince's calmness, it was all so petrifying. He didn't scream, he didn't shout. Witnesses said that he was like a robot, just methodically executing his sickening task. It took 5 grueling hours before the police were finally able to make a move at 1:30 a.m. on July 31st. Because this is when Vince finally decided to make an attempt to escape by breaking through a window. Now, I gotta talk about this for a second, because one thing that confuses me about this is like, why didn't the police and this tactical unit in full gear just forcibly bust open the door 5 hours earlier? No one else in terms of passengers or potential victims were on that bus at that point, and it was clear that Tim was gone. So why wait 5 hours? I looked into this because it was really bothering me, and apparently non-present SWAT team members later critiqued responding officers for not putting an end to this nightmare sooner. So I guess they had the same thought, and they analyzed what the fuck happened or what didn't happen. There is the argument, of course, which we'll explore shortly, that Vince was so clearly unwell that, say, shooting him would have been less a tactical decision and more of an execution, one that could have sparked national outrage and legal scrutiny. But then again, letting a man eat another human being that he just slaughtered for 5 fucking straight hours isn't exactly a masterclass in crisis intervention either. I guess I'm more wondering, why didn't they just subdue him on the bus? There's nobody left on that bus for him to have potentially hurt, except himself. Yes, I will give you that. And we know, he was unwell. So I do see that argument. But anyway, after 5 hours, RCMP moved in and they quickly subdued him with 2 laser shots and a canine officer's teeth before cuffing him and placing him into the back of a cruiser, and then taking him straight to the hospital to treat the injuries that he sustained during the massacre. And remember, they only finally were able to subdue him or to make a move to subdue him once Vince tried to leave the bus. He tried to escape through a window. Only then did they make their move. Discovered inside plastic bags in Vince's pockets were part of Tim's dismembered body, including his ear, nose, and tongue. 1/3 of Tim's eyes, as well as part of his heart, were never found, and it's assumed that those parts in particular were eaten during the hours of carnage. After his arrest, Vince fell silent except to mutter, quote, "Please kill me." Now, the surviving passengers, forever scarred by what they witnessed, were taken to a nearby RCMP detachment to be interviewed. By 10 a.m., Greyhound representatives had arranged for them all to receive fresh clothing and essentials, as all of their belongings had been on that bus. By 3:30 p.m., the passengers or survivors were reunited with their families in Winnipeg, left to piece together the unthinkable. The scene was so horrific, and this is really devastating, that one of the first responders, Corporal Ken Barker of the RCMP, never recovered. And in July 2014, he took his own life after sending messages to loved ones saying, "I'm too broken to ever be fixed." And that's crushing. When Vince Lee appeared before the court in Portage-la-Prairie facing a charge of second-degree murder, he just looked hollowed out, like a man already half in the grave. The only words he reportedly managed to speak, as I said, were "please kill me," a reflection of a man who had officially unraveled and was offering up his life in exchange for silence from the voices in his own head, and maybe, too, as punishment for the innocent life that he ripped from this realm. Pop quiz, just to shake it up here. Which statement is true? A, Greyhound offered survivors lifetime free bus fare and access to a complimentary therapy dog in Winnipeg named Coach. B, Tim McLean's headphones were auctioned on eBay by someone claiming to have retrieved them from the bus. Bidding reached over $10,000 before the listing was eventually removed. C, the week following the attack, Greyhound Canada pulled a series of nationwide advertisements which included the no longer accurate slogan, quote, "There's a reason you've never heard of bus rage," end quote. So, A, they offered a gift card and a therapy dog. B, Tim's headphones were auctioned on eBay. Or C, Canada had to pull their advertising that, there's no such thing as bus rage. The answer is C. Apparently, they had this whole campaign going, ironically, that there's no reason, there's a reason you've never heard of bus rage. Just kidding. So Vince Lee's trial began on March 3rd, 2009, and he entered a plea of not criminally responsible, or NCR, due to mental disorder, which is a legal admission that, yes, the killing happened, but the mind behind it was not capable of grasping its own reality, let alone forming the mens rea, which is the intent required to be held legally accountable. So mens rea is the cornerstone of criminal responsibility. Without it, the law recognizes that a person may commit an act without truly understanding its nature, consequences, or wrongfulness. Court-appointed psychiatrist Dr. Stanley Yaron, who I mentioned earlier, testified that Vince was in the grips of untreated, full-blown schizophrenia. In his delusion, Tim McLean wasn't a man, but rather a demonic entity cloaked in human skin, an alien threat that needed to be eliminated and dismembered to prevent resurrection and potential harm to other passengers on that bus. Vince wasn't just hearing voices, he was obeying them. Voices he believed to be divine, commanding him to kill the man beside him or face death himself. It was a rare moment of unity in the courtroom, as both the defense and the prosecution agreed with Dr. Yaron's assessment. So at that point, the issue wasn't necessarily about criminal punishment. It became about clinical containment. Even the Crown supported involuntary psychiatric commitment over a prison sentence. And that's because what Vince Lee suffered from wasn't some fleeting mental break or an excuse. It was full-blown, untreated schizophrenia, a chronic brain disorder that, when left unmanaged, can fracture reality into a minefield of hallucinations, delusions, and paranoia. In Vince's case, the illness manifested in such terrifying ways. He truly believed that Tim McLean was a demonic alien sent to kill him and others, and that God himself was commanding him to strike first. Now, that said, please do not mistake my empathy and understanding of Vince's mental health condition for absolution or indifference to the sheer horror of what he did, because I do always empathize with mental health issues. But recognizing that someone was profoundly unwell does not erase the terror, the trauma, or the irreversible pain inflicted on Tim McLean and everyone who loved him. It just means that we're capable of holding two truths at once, I think, that Vince Lee was sick and that Tim's death was still tragic beyond measure. So compassion doesn't cancel accountability, it just reframes where we direct it. That being said, my question, or maybe it's more of a lingering confusion, is this. Yes, Vince may have felt compelled to commit the crime, truly believing that he was saving humanity from a demonic alien that was masquerading as a man. But somewhere in his psyche, he still appeared to understand that what he was doing wasn't socially or legally acceptable, or morally acceptable, however you want to say it. He tried to flee the scene when he could. He resisted arrest. He told officers to kill him. He brought plastic bags with him and a hunting knife onto a public bus. So, to me, I question, are these the actions of someone who believes that they're going to save the world? Or are they premeditated decisions and then subsequent reactions of someone who, on some level, knew that he'd crossed a line? Like, where's the threshold? How do we differentiate between complete delusion and fractured insight, between moral incapacity and moral awareness clouded by mental illness? That's the gray zone that NCR cases force us to sit with. It's not always about absolutes. It's about how far a mind must splinter before we can say unequivocally that accountability no longer applies. In the end, or really the beginning, the presiding judge here, Justice John Scurfield, ruled that Vince Lee was not criminally responsible for his abhorrent crime. Thus, instead of a prison cell, Vince was automatically transferred to the care of the Manitoba Criminal Review Board, which placed him committed to the Selkirk Mental Health Care Center in Manitoba for treatment and monitoring for an undetermined amount of time. But not everyone agreed with the fact that Vince Lee was deemed not criminally responsible for slaughtering an innocent man and therefore not placed behind bars. Mainly Tim's mom, Carol DeDelay. This is what she said, quote, Vince Lee committed one of the most horrific murders in Canadian history and has faded back into society. My son is still dead, end quote. Following the verdict, Carol became an outspoken advocate for legal reform, deeply unsettled by what she viewed as a gap in public safety. She said, I do not believe public safety is of paramount concern when mass murderers and serial killers can plead NCR. She stated, and this was referencing, obviously, when I say NCR, if you recall, that stands for not criminally responsible, and it's a designation that ultimately spared Vince Lee a prison sentence. Despite her tireless efforts, Carol was unable to bring about legislative change. She said, quote, I feel like I at least raised awareness that the NCR defense even existed. I had never heard of it before Timothy's murder, but I failed to drive the kind of reform that would meaningfully strengthen the law or prevent this from happening to someone else, end quote. My heart genuinely aches for Tim's mother and his entire circle of loved ones. In many ways, they were not afforded the dignity, transparency, or support that one might expect following such an unfathomable loss. One of the most troubling aspects was the closed nature of Vince's trial. So it was conducted without the usual public proceedings. That means that witnesses were not called. And more critically, I think that Tim's family was not given the opportunity to share their voices or speak on the record about their son, his life, or the impact of his violent death. In a justice system that often claims to center victims and their families, this omission felt particularly jarring, and it left those who were closest to Tim not only grieving an unimaginable tragedy, but also largely sidelined from the very process that was meant to deliver justice, or at the very least, some sense of closure. And the reason why Vince's trial was closed was primarily because pleading not criminally responsible on account of mental disorder, which is NCRMD, is a legal mechanism in Canada that shifts the courtroom focus from guilt to mental state. The process from there moves quickly, without a jury, without witness testimony, and without opportunity for the victim's family to speak. In cases like this where criminal intent, again, mens rea, isn't being debated, trials are often streamlined to determine clinical responsibility rather than legal culpability. Additionally, the court sought to protect the confidentiality of Vince's psychiatric evaluations and medical records, which are shielded by privacy law. Given the deeply graphic nature of the crime, the closed courtroom may have been intended to minimize public trauma and avoid turning the proceedings into an absolute media spectacle. But again, while these legal decisions were procedurally sound, they left Tim's family feeling absolutely excluded and voiceless. During his time at the Selkirk Mental Health Center, Vince's practitioners took hours and hours of video footage of their sessions with him and interviews, and they kept detailed transcripts, and they continued to adjust his medication as needed based on his progress. And just 1 year after entering treatment, they even began allowing Vince to enjoy small supervised freedoms away from the facility. By February 2015, Will graduated to being allowed unsupervised day passes to visit Winnipeg as long as he carried a functioning cell phone with him at the time. Then he was moved out of the psychiatric facility and into a group home. By 2016, Vince Lee officially changed his name to Will Lee Baker and was permitted to leave his group home to live independently. And, get this, you guys, on February 26, 2017, after winning the right to live alone upon the recommendation of the Manitoba Criminal Code Review Board, Will Baker, formerly known as Vince Lee, the murderous beheading cannibal, was granted an absolute discharge. And by absolute, I mean that he was free from all legal obligations and or restrictions pertaining to living independently in the free world. No one was or is required to supervise whether or not he takes his medication regularly and reliably. Unbelievable. Pop quiz. When Vince was discharged, what were the odds, according to one psychiatrist, that he might relapse? A, 0.8%, B, 6.5%, C, 12%. The answer is A. According to one psychiatrist, he had a 0.8% chance of relapsing. But the fact that he was allowed to leave, unsupervised, nobody checking in, nobody monitoring him mental health-wise, even legal-wise, right? Like no parole officer, nothing. Bit of a kick in the face, not only to Tim McLean, but to his friends, family, and every single survivor of Greyhound Bus 1170. Because, and I say this as carefully and respectfully as I can, and I hope you know me well enough to know where I'm coming from, the position that I take, right? There is a difference between the kind of mental illness that millions of people bravely manage every single day and the kind that, when paired with untreated psychosis, delusions of divine warfare, and a total break from reality, results in an outlier so extreme like this that it just defies comprehension. We're not talking about depression or anxiety here. We're talking about a catastrophic collapse of identity, morality, and cognition. And while Vince Lee was found not criminally responsible, The trauma he left in his wake was so very real, so permanent, and some might argue criminal in every other sense of the word. Total unsupervised freedom? I consider myself an extremely compassionate person, sometimes to a fault. But I'll be honest, there's no way I would want my children or anyone else's children near him unless I had ironclad confirmation that he was properly medicated and stable. You can't confirm that. You can't guarantee that if you're not watching him. Compassion doesn't mean abandoning common sense. Tim's mom stated the following: Lee has an incurable disease that makes him do terrible things. I believe he needs to be in an institution to address those needs. I don't think it matters if you're mentally ill or not. If you kill someone, you should lose your freedom, period. Now listen, losing his freedom, and that's even more extreme, I think, even than where my head is. If he's going to be out, right? If he's been treated and he's deemed in a position where he can reacclimate into society, that's one thing, but you can't do that. You can't give that grace without being absolutely sure that he's not going to relapse. And you can only be sure if you're watching him and you're making sure he's taking his medication. But again, if he was cleared medically, if he was deemed, better, for lack of a better way of putting it, then shouldn't he be allowed to, reacclimate into society? I don't know. That's devil's advocate. As I said, I would not want my children near somebody who did what he did and isn't being monitored. Incredibly, and certainly to the dismay of Tim's loved ones, Will Baker, right, because that's his new name, was deemed capable of reintegrating back into society. Dr. Jeffrey Waldman, Will Baker's psychiatrist, told the board that he was confident that Baker will remain compliant with his medication regimen and will continue working closely with his treatment team upon release. In other words, they're not watching to make sure it happens, but they're confident that it will. Dr. Waldman has emphasized that Will Baker understands it is the medication that keeps his psychiatric condition in check. In its written decision, the review board concluded that, quote, the weight of evidence does not substantiate that Mr. Baker poses a significant threat to public safety, end quote. Additionally, Chris Somerville, who's the executive director of the Manitoba Schizophrenia Society, met and worked with Baker throughout his time in care, and he indicated the following: he is no longer a violent person. I will say, yes, he absolutely understands that he has to take his medication and he has a desire to live a responsible, moral life and never succumb to psychotic episodes and not to hurt anybody ever again. End quote. I have no doubt that his intention is pure, Will Baker, that he does not ever want to do what he did and that he never wanted to do it in the first place. He was quite literally unable to stop himself. So I don't doubt his intentions. Given the severity of his crime, intentions, in my humble opinion, which are meaningless and you can disagree, it's not enough. It's not enough to let somebody who slaughtered, dismembered, and cannibalized a human being back into the world because his intentions are pure. I don't know. I don't know. Pop quiz, you guys. Let's get out of this headspace. Yes or no? In Canada, does an individual found not criminally responsible, NCR, retain a criminal record if the review board later grants them an absolute discharge? Yes or no? The answer is nope. Nope, nope, nope. Which means, legally speaking, it's like the crime never happened. I think Tim's mom, Carol, said it best. That means, and this is a quote, that means the crazed killer turned patient could potentially be working with children, the elderly and vulnerable, because they have no criminal record. Vince Lee changed his name to Will Baker and may well have changed it again. We have no idea where he is. He is not required to report anywhere or to treat his lifelong illness. And that's the end of her quote. And I feel that. I feel that as a human being with compassion, but also a rational mind. I think that as a mother whose children lives in this world with Will Baker or whatever his name may be, I have complete empathy for mental health issues, and I want nothing more than for people who struggle with mental health issues to be able to live normal lives. but he did an absolutely atrocious thing. So to not keep an eye on him is terrifying to me. One idea might be to have some sort of registry, kind of like the sex offenders registry, where, those individuals are cleared from their crimes in a sense that they're back into society, but they're forced to register their location, maybe some type of radar on which we place individuals. Yes, he's not considered a criminal, Will Baker / Vince Lee, but he did do something that I think probably warrants some type of monitoring and maybe some type of registry is the way to do it. But it does get tricky, just kind of going off the cuff here, you guys, does get tricky because he was not labeled a criminal, right? So technically, why should he have to check in with anyone? Why should he have to, right? This is the tricky part about his defense and what the Canadian law deemed him to be, right? Not criminally responsible. It's tricky. The tragedy of Tim McLean's death at the hands of Vince Lee or Will Baker is more than just a horror story. It is a grim indictment of what happens when society treats mental health care as a last resort rather than a first line of defense. Before the headlines, before the Greyhound bus, before the incomprehensible violence, there were signs, years of them. Vince Lee was not invisible. He was unraveling in plain sight. His wife noticed, his coworkers noticed, his parents noticed. He wandered highways, malnourished and paranoid, heard voices telling him that he was the second coming sent to stop an alien invasion, and still no structure intervened. He refused help, yes, but that refusal was not born of stubbornness. It was shaped by untreated schizophrenia, a disorder that distorts reality, undermines insight, and convinces the sufferer that everyone trying to help is part of the threat. We wait until someone's delusions explode into public tragedy, and only then do we offer the kind of comprehensive psychiatric support that could have rewritten the entire story. Only then do we assign a team, secure a facility, mandate medication. And by that point, or by this point in the case, it was too late for Tim. Too late for the passengers on that bus who still live with the trauma. And too late, maybe, arguably, for Vince, who now lives with the horror of what his unwell mind told him was righteous. This is the cost of a reactive mental health system. Mental illness does not emerge in a vacuum. It simmers, it evolves, and like any other medical condition, it responds best when it's caught early and treated consistently. Imagine if we treated heart disease the way we treat psychosis, waiting until the first cardiac arrest before intervening. The solution is not simple, but to me it's clear. We need to destigmatize early treatment, normalize screenings, make mental health care as routine and non-negotiable as dental cleanings or blood pressure checks at your doctor's office. Schools, workplaces, immigration systems, all of these can be front lines for detection if we're willing to see mental health as part of public health rather than an optional afterthought. Because every time we wait until after the break, after the voices, after the act, we risk another irreversible outcome. Tim McLean should still be alive, and Will Baker should have been helped long before he became infamous. And the next Will Baker is out there right now, struggling, unraveling, unheard. And what we do today could change their tomorrow. Timothy Richard McLean Jr. was born on October 3rd, 1985 at Victoria General Hospital. He grew up both in Winnipeg and Ellie, surrounded by a big, beautiful extended family, including parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, multiple siblings, and a little niece. Tim was very active. He loved soccer, football, and motorbikes, and was incredibly adventurous, outgoing, and full of life. He apparently loved pulling pranks and making people laugh as well. In his obituary, his parents stated, "There was a whole world to see, and everywhere he went, he brought light and joy. From your first breath, you were loved beyond imagination, and although you were taken from us too quickly, we will never say goodbye. But for now, see you later. You will be carried in our hearts, minds, and souls." 5 months after Tim McLean's death, his girlfriend gave birth to his son, a child he never got to hold, never got to kiss goodnight, never got to tell he loved. A son who will grow up with questions no child should ever have to ask, and a space in his life that no one can ever truly fill. It's a heartbreaking reminder that the ripple effects of violence and untreated mental health issues do not end with the victim. They can, and often do, echo through generations. And that's the case. That is the case that I replay in my head almost every time I take public transportation. So I hope you guys don't now start doing that. If you do, I'm so sorry. It is never my intention to traumatize you or to bring you into my dark headspace. But still, I lived through that case. I remember it so well. So I have that perspective, which is interesting. Obviously, most of these cases, I don't have such a visceral response to, although I always empathize with the victim. But this one, I remember the headlines. Okay, well, now that I've brought the darkness, I would like to bring some lights. I would like to offer you a palate cleanser in the form of Cash Slater. Obviously, because Cash punched a bee. And I need you to know about this. Like an actual buzzing, flying, minding its own beeswax bee, except it wasn't minding its own beeswax because it was flying all up in my face. And I was flailing and shrieking like I just walked into a horror movie. And my big, brave Cashy boy came charging outside like it was his Marvel origin story. So first, he tried to catch the bee with his beak, 10 out of 10 for effort. When that didn't work, he straight up threw paws. One massive black paw with his little white sock. Boom! Bye, bitch. So guess what I call him now? Obviously, think about it, guys. His name is Cash, and he threw punches at a bee. I now call him Cassius Clay, which was Muhammad Ali's birth name. Float like a butterfly, sting like a bee, / not because my dog bitch slapped you. And that's all I got for you today. I want to thank you guys so much for sticking it out with me, being here through the end. If you're still here, you are the realest of the real. You have my whole heart and all of my gratitude, as always. Let me know what you thought about the case. I'm on socials doing some really fun things. My handle's at Investigator Slater, Instagram, TikTok. Join me over there. Patreon.com/Psychopedia Pod if you want more true crime content and other stuff. Wink, wink. And I just, if this is where you are, I'm so happy to be here with you. And I will see you next week. Thanks for listening. Bye.